The CSS Helianthus hummed with the particular frequency that came from housing 17 different species in close quarters. Environmental systems working overtime to maintain compatible atmospheres. Translation suites processing dozens of languages simultaneously. The background noise of a functioning diplomatic vessel. Dr. Finn Kowalski barely noticed anymore. After 2 months aboard, the ship's ambient chaos had become familiar enough to fade into background texture. He sat in the linguistics lab, reviewing footage from today's negotiation session between the Thaler Collective and the Vreen Assembly. 2 species on the brink of war over territorial boundaries, neither could adequately communicate. The Thaler communicated through bioluminescent patterns. The Vreen used harmonic resonances, both considered verbal language primitive. Finn's job was finding common ground between incompatible communication systems. It was fascinating work when it wasn't absolutely maddening. The footage showed the negotiation chamber, both delegations arranged on opposite sides with careful spatial buffers. And between them, mediating with the kind of grace that made diplomacy look effortless, was Commander Lyra Shenville. Finn had tried very hard not to become fascinated by her. He'd failed spectacularly. She was Resonai, a species of natural telepaths whose abilities made most of the galaxy deeply uncomfortable. Nobody liked working alongside someone who could perceive thoughts radiating from their mind like heat from fire. But Lyra was exceptional even among her people. Her telepathic range and sensitivity were off the charts, which made her invaluable for diplomatic work and incredibly unsettling for everyone else. She looked humanoid enough that humans found her beautiful rather than alien. Elegant features, silver eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you, pointed ears that swiveled independently to track sounds. Her most distinctive features were the neural crest markings, delicate raised lines running from her temples down her neck and arms, glowing faintly with bioluminescence when she actively used her telepathic senses. In the footage, those markings blazed bright as she mediated between hostile delegations. She moved between the Thaler and Vreen with predatory grace, reading emotional states in real time, adjusting her approach based on telepathic feedback only she could perceive. She was magnificent. The thought formed before Finn could stop it, clear and unguarded. She's the most fascinating person I've ever met, and I'm absolutely not supposed to be thinking about her like this. He'd been careful for 2 months, maintaining mental discipline whenever they interacted. He knew Resonai telepathy worked as ambient perception. They heard surface thoughts like background noise, emotional impressions rather than detailed content. Nothing deep unless someone deliberately projected or their shields were catastrophically compromised. So he'd been controlled, professional. He'd researched Resonai cultural protocols extensively, learned to think in carefully curated patterns around telepaths. But right now, alone in the lab at 2300 hours, exhausted from analyzing communication patterns all day, his mental shields had apparently decided to take a break. Movement in the corridor outside the lab pulled his attention. Lyra was walking past, clearly heading back to her quarters after the long negotiation session. Then she stopped mid-stride. Her head turned slowly toward the lab's transparent wall, silver eyes finding Finn through the glass. Her neural markings pulsed brighter, the telltale sign of active telepathic reception. A slow smile curved her mouth, predatory and amused. Finn's stomach dropped. Oh no. Oh no, she heard that. Lyra changed direction, entering the lab with deliberate steps. Her neural markings were still glowing, confirming she was receiving his panicked internal monologue. This is professional disaster. Why is she still smiling? Can she hear me panicking right now? Of course she can, oh God. She stopped at his workstation, leaning close enough that Finn could see the intricate patterns of her neural markings in detail. He'd only observed from professional distance before. When she spoke, her voice came out low and dangerous, with amusement threading through every word. Careful, human, I hear everything. Finn froze. His brain helpfully supplied approximately 17 different mortified responses, all of which Lyra could presumably hear because her smile widened. "Commander," he managed, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "I apologize, that was honest," Lyra interrupted, still smiling. "Refreshing, possibly the first unguarded thought you've had around me in 2 months." "That's inappropriate," Finn finished weakly. "That too." She pulled up a chair and sat across from him with fluid grace, looking entirely too pleased with the situation. "You've been very carefully controlled around me, Dr. Kowalski. Impressive mental discipline for a human. Most of your species broadcast surface thoughts constantly without realizing it. I've studied cultural protocols. I know telepaths prefer people who maintain basic courtesy by not thinking loudly. We do appreciate it." Her neural markings pulsed softer colors now, less predatory. "But you were tired, your shields dropped, and I got to hear what you actually think when you're not performing mental courtesy." Finn desperately wanted to salvage some professional dignity from this disaster. "I'll work on better control." "Don't." The word came out sharp enough that Finn looked up in surprise. Lyra's expression had shifted to something more serious. "Most people think very carefully curated thoughts around me. Polite things, professional things. Things they think I want to hear." She leaned forward slightly. "Your genuine reaction, calling me fascinating rather than terrifying or intrusive, that was refreshing." "You're definitely terrifying," Finn said before his brain caught up with his mouth. "But also fascinating. Those aren't mutually exclusive." Lyra laughed, a genuine sound that made her neural markings pulse warm gold. "Perfect example. You just thought that before you said it. I heard the decision to be honest override the instinct to be polite. That seems like an unfair advantage in conversation." "It absolutely is." She settled back in her chair, looking more relaxed than Finn had ever seen her. "Would you like to know what I've been hearing from you for the past 2 months?" Finn wasn't sure he wanted to know, but curiosity won out. "What?" "Caution, professional distance. Mental recitation of cultural protocols whenever I entered a room." Her neural markings shifted to thoughtful blue, and underneath all that, curiosity. "Genuine, intense curiosity about how my abilities work, what I perceive, how I process telepathic information." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried weight. "Not fear or discomfort like most species. Not the usual anxiety about whether I'm invading privacy, just fascination." She said the word deliberately, echoing his earlier thought. "You wanted to understand rather than just tolerate. That's rare." Finn processed this, aware that his response was probably broadcasting before he spoke it. "That's my job, xenolinguist. I study communication systems. Telepathy is just another form of communication." "Is that all it is?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications Finn wasn't prepared to examine. He deflected. "What do you actually hear when you're around me?" Lyra considered this, her expression turning thoughtful. "Impressions more than words. Emotional coloring attached to surface thoughts. Right now, you're embarrassed but also curious, which is warring with professional anxiety about appropriate conduct around superior officers." She tilted her head, studying him. "And there's something else, a brightness. Your thoughts feel like," she searched for words, "sunlight on water, clear, focused. Most humans are muddier, more chaotic, but you organize your thoughts in linguistic patterns. Multiple languages layered together. It's pleasant to perceive." "Pleasant is good," Finn said, trying not to think too hard about how her compliment made him feel. Lyra's neural markings pulsed amused gold again. "Too late. I already heard the happiness spike. This is going to take getting used to." "Most people never get used to it, they just get better at hiding." She stood, stretching with feline grace. "But I don't want you to hide, Dr. Kowalski. Your unguarded thoughts are far more interesting than your polite ones." She headed for the door, then paused and looked back. "And for what it's worth, I find you fascinating too." She left before Finn could formulate a response. which was probably good because his brain had temporarily stopped processing language in favor of just cycling through "she said what" on repeat. He sat alone in the linguistics lab, staring at frozen footage of Lyra mediating between hostile species, and tried very carefully not to think about how that conversation felt like the most genuine connection he'd had in years. His brain, being helpful, immediately thought exactly that in clear mental words that presumably broadcast into the empty lab. Somewhere in the corridor, he could have sworn he heard Lyra laugh. Finn spent the next day avoiding Lyra, which was impossible on a ship where they both worked in command sections and kept similar schedules. He saw her during the morning briefing, again during diplomatic prep, 3 times in the corridors. Each time, her neural markings pulsed amused colors, and Finn knew she could hear him actively trying not to think about their conversation. By evening, he'd accepted defeat and returned to his linguistics lab, which had apparently become their unofficial meeting point. Lyra arrived 20 minutes later, carrying 2 containers of something that smelled like tea. "You've been broadcasting anxiety all day," she said, handing him a container. "Chamomile helps humans relax. I checked the medical database." Finn accepted the tea, touched by the gesture despite his continued mortification. "Thanks." She sat across from him, and they sipped tea in companionable silence for several minutes before Lyra spoke again. "You're still trying to shield. It's making you obvious." "How is trying to be polite making me obvious?" "Because your natural thought patterns are complex and multi-layered. When you try to control them, they flatten into simple broadcasts that basically scream, 'I'm hiding something.'" Her neural markings pulsed gentle blue. "I've already mapped your baseline. The courtesy ship has sailed." Finn laughed despite himself. "That's actually reassuring in a weird way. If you've already heard the embarrassing stuff, there's less pressure to maintain perfect control." "Exactly." Lyra's smile was warm. "Ask me what you've been wanting to ask all day." "What makes you think I want to ask something?" "Because you're a xenolinguist who just discovered someone who communicates in ways human science barely understands. Your curiosity is louder than your embarrassment." She was right. Finn's professional fascination had been warring with personal awkwardness all day. "What does it actually feel like?" he asked, perceiving other people's thoughts. Lyra set down her tea, her expression turning thoughtful. "Imagine being in a room where everyone is having different conversations simultaneously, some loud, some quiet. You can't help but hear the ambient noise, but you can choose which conversations to focus on." "That sounds overwhelming." "It can be, especially in crowded areas with high emotions, but Rez and I learned to filter from childhood. We build mental shields that dampen the ambient noise to manageable levels." Her neural markings pulsed slowly. "What I hear from most people is surface noise, immediate reactions, strong emotions, thoughts they're actively focusing on. I can't dig deeper unless someone's shields are compromised or they deliberately project." "What about consent, privacy?" "Important questions." Lyra's expression turned serious. "Rezonai culture has strict protocols about telepathic boundaries. We're taught from childhood that perceiving isn't the same as having permission to engage. I hear ambient thoughts, yes, but I don't act on that information without consent unless there's immediate danger." She leaned forward. "Think of it like hearing conversations in a public space. You can't help but overhear, but you don't join conversations you weren't invited to." Finn processed this, his linguist brain cataloging the communication framework. "So when you heard my thoughts last night, ambient perception, you were broadcasting into a public space." Her smile turned teasing. "But when I chose to engage with those thoughts, to comment on them, that was me accepting your unintentional invitation to conversation. I didn't intend to invite anything." "I know, but you also didn't try to rebuild shields when I approached. On some level, you wanted me to hear." Finn couldn't argue with that. He'd been curious about Lyra for months, carefully suppressing that curiosity under professional courtesy. Having it unexpectedly exposed had been mortifying but also liberating. "What do you hear from me right now?" he asked. Lyra's neural markings brightened as she focused her telepathic senses. Curiosity still. Professional and personal mixed together. You're genuinely interested in how my abilities work, but you're also interested in me specifically. There's warmth when you look at me, attraction you're trying to be polite about. She paused. And underneath everything there's that brightness again, like your thoughts are smiling. Thoughts can smile. Yours do. Her own smile was gentle. It's one of the things I like about your mental voice. Most humans I encounter are anxious around me. Your anxiety is there, but it's outweighed by curiosity and, she stopped, her markings flushing colors Finn didn't recognize. And what? Affection, she said quietly. You genuinely like me. Not despite my telepathy but including it. That's rare. Finn felt his own face heat. Is this the part where I try to pretend that's not completely obvious? You could, but I'd still hear the truth underneath. Lyra's expression turned vulnerable in ways he'd never seen from her. Most people see my telepathy as an obstacle to connection. Either they're uncomfortable with the intimacy imbalance, or they're fascinated by my abilities rather than me as a person. But what about me? You're fascinated by both. The abilities because you're a linguist who sees telepathy as communication worth understanding. Me because her neural markings pulsed uncertain gold. Because you see me as a person who happens to have these abilities, not as abilities that happen to have a person attached. That's accurate, Finn admitted. You're brilliant and capable and occasionally terrifying. The telepathy is part of that, but it's not all you are. Lyra's smile was radiant. There, that thought. That's exactly what I mean about your mental voice being pleasant. They talked for hours after that. About resonant culture, about human linguistic theory, about the challenges of communication across species. Lyra explained how she'd learned to navigate a galaxy that feared telepaths, how she'd chosen diplomatic work, because her abilities were useful enough that people tolerated their discomfort. Finn told her about his work in xenolinguistics, about growing up fascinated by how different species conceptualized language, about the specific joy of finding common ground between incompatible communication systems. Is that what we're doing? Lyra asked eventually, finding common ground between incompatible systems. Maybe, Finn met her eyes. Telepathic and non-telepathic, that's about as incompatible as it gets. And yet here we are, communicating effectively. Here we are, Finn agreed. When they finally parted for the evening, Finn walked back to his quarters with his mind full of everything they'd discussed. He wasn't trying to shield his thoughts anymore. Lyra was right that it just made him obvious. Instead, he let himself think honestly about how much he'd enjoyed their conversation, how her presence made his pulse quicken, how her rare smiles felt like personal victories. Somewhere on the ship, Lyra was presumably hearing all of it. Finn discovered he didn't mind. Over the following weeks, dangerous patterns developed. Finn and Lyra gravitated toward each other during off-duty hours, their conversations ranging across linguistics theory, personal history, philosophical debates about consciousness and communication. Finn learned to manage his thoughts around her, not shielding, but allowing genuine reactions while trying not to broadcast complete embarrassment every time she smiled at him. It wasn't perfect control. Lyra still heard plenty of wayward thoughts, but she seemed to enjoy the challenge of someone whose mind jumped between languages and conceptual frameworks fast enough to keep her telepathic senses engaged. She taught him the basics of deliberate projection, thinking at her rather than just near her. It was surprisingly easy once he understood the mechanism, just focusing his thoughts with intent to communicate rather than letting them drift as ambient noise. Can you hear this? He projected during a conversation about Vreen harmonic communication. Lyra's neural markings brightened and she smiled. Perfectly. You're a natural at this. Or you're just very good at reception. Both can be true. But there was tension underneath their friendship. unspoken attraction both were pretending didn't exist for professional reasons. Finn caught himself thinking things he shouldn't. How striking Lyra looked when focused on complex problems, what it would be like to touch the glowing neural markings along her arms, how her telepathic senses would perceive physical intimacy. Each time, Lyra's neural markings pulsed brighter, confirming she received every wayward thought. Once, after Finn spent 30 seconds imagining what kissing a telepath would feel like, wondering if she'd hear his thoughts become incoherent with desire, Lyra's breath caught audibly. "Your thoughts are getting dangerous," she said, her voice strained. "I know, sorry." "Don't apologize, just—" She met his eyes and her expression was conflicted. "Be aware that I'm hearing all of it and I'm not unaffected." Finn processed the implications of that statement while his brain helpfully supplied increasingly detailed thoughts about what affected might look like on her. Lyra's neural markings flared brilliant gold. "Finn, stop." "Right, stopping." He tried to think about linguistics. Failed completely. They maintained careful professional distance after that conversation, both aware they were approaching boundaries that shouldn't be crossed between officers serving together. Then the Thaler-Vreen negotiations reached crisis point. The talks had been progressing slowly, both species making incremental concessions, but old hatred ran deep, centuries of cultural conflict that wouldn't resolve quickly. The breaking point came when a Thaler delegate made a bioluminescent display that the Vreen delegation interpreted as profound insult. Though whether it was genuinely meant that way or just lost in translation, nobody could determine. Both delegations walked out. Threats of military action resumed. The entire diplomatic mission balanced on the edge of catastrophic failure. The captain called an emergency meeting. "We have 48 hours to salvage this before both species formally withdraw from negotiations and likely resume hostilities. Commander Shenville, I need you to conduct deep telepathic mediation. Go beyond surface impressions and actually map the emotional states driving both delegations. Find the real sticking points buried under political posturing." Lyra nodded, her expression professional despite the tension Finn could see in her shoulders. "That will require sustained contact with multiple hostile minds simultaneously. It's intensive. Can you do it?" "Yes, sir." The mediation session began the next morning and lasted 6 brutal hours. Finn watched from the observation deck, monitoring the proceedings with growing concern. Lyra stood between the Thaler and Vreen delegations, her neural markings blazing bright enough to be visible even from a distance. She was reading both groups simultaneously, perceiving their fears, their genuine grievances, the emotional weight beneath political positions. It was extraordinary to watch. She'd identify when someone's stated position contradicted their emotional state and gently probe until the real concern emerged. She'd sense when hostility was masking fear and reframe discussions to address underlying anxieties. But Finn could see the toll. Her movements became less fluid as the session progressed. Her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. The brightness of her neural markings indicated her telepathic senses were wide open, unshielded, taking in everything. 6 hours of filtering hostility and fear and centuries of cultural hatred. When the session finally broke for evening recess, the delegations had made genuine progress, both sides acknowledging legitimate concerns, agreeing to reconvene tomorrow with specific compromise proposals. It was a diplomatic victory. The captain looked pleased. The other officers congratulated Lyra on her skillful mediation, but Finn watched her practically collapse into a chair in the observation deck the moment the delegations left, and he knew something was wrong. He approached cautiously. "Lyra." She looked up and her eyes were unfocused. Her neural markings, which had been blazing bright during the session, were now so dim they were barely visible. "Telepathic burnout," she said, her voice rough. "Too many hostile minds for too long. My shields are compromised. I'm perceiving everything with no filter." Finn's concern spiked. He felt it himself, and suspected Lyra was receiving it amplified through her oversensitive telepathic state. Her wince confirmed it. "You should probably leave. I can't control what I'm receiving right now, and She stopped, but Finn felt the weight of what she wasn't saying. He sat down beside her instead of leaving. "What am I?" "Loud." The word came out as a whisper. "Your concern is loud. Your worry for me is loud. And underneath that," her neural markings pulsed weakly, "everything you've been carefully not thinking for weeks is right on the surface, and I can hear all of it." Finn knew he should leave. Professional conduct demanded it. But Lyra looked fragile and overwhelmed, and his concern for her overrode his concern for propriety. He stayed, and he thought deliberately, projecting clearly. "I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to face this alone." Lyra's eyes widened. "That was intentional. You projected that on purpose." "Yeah." Finn discovered that deliberate mental communication felt more natural than he'd expected. "Is this okay? Should I stop?" She closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier. "It's like having someone speak directly to me instead of just hearing ambient noise. It's clearer. Easier to process when everything else is overwhelming." So Finn stayed, and he carefully, deliberately thought comforting thoughts at her. Not complex ideas, just simple, genuine feelings. "You did amazing work today. Both delegations made progress they couldn't have achieved without you." Lyra's neural markings brightened slightly, responding to his focused projection. "You're brilliant and capable, and it's okay to be exhausted after that much work." Her breath evened out, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I'm here. You're safe. Just focus on my thoughts and let everything else fade to background noise." For an hour, Finn maintained a steady stream of gentle mental presence, not demanding her attention, just providing an anchor point through the overwhelming flood of unfiltered telepathic input. He thought about linguistics research to give her something intellectually engaging but not emotionally intense. He projected calm whenever her distress spiked. He was just there in her mind, a deliberate presence rather than ambient noise. Gradually, Lyra's shields began rebuilding. The telepathic burnout receded. Her neural markings regained some of their normal luminescence. When she finally opened her eyes and looked at him, her expression was vulnerable and grateful in equal measure. "Thank you," she said aloud, then added mentally, "That was the kindest thing anyone's ever done for me." Finn felt the thought as clearly as if she'd spoken it, and realized with sudden clarity that she'd deliberately projected back. For the first time, she was letting him hear her thoughts the way she heard his. "You're welcome," he projected, and then, because her shields were still fragile and he knew she'd hear it anyway, "I care about you. More than is probably appropriate, but there it is." Lyra's hand found his, fingers interlacing with warmth that felt like coming home. "I know, I've been hearing it for weeks. And Finn," she projected deliberately, her mental voice clear and warm, "I care about you too. Which is why we need to talk about what we're doing." They sat in the observation deck, hands still joined, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. Intimacy created through Finn choosing to let her hear his thoughts rather than hiding them, through Lyra deliberately sharing her own mental voice rather than just receiving his. Outside the windows, stars wheeled past in familiar patterns. Inside, two people from incompatible communication systems were building a bridge neither had expected but both desperately wanted. "Tomorrow," Lyra said finally. "After the final negotiation session, we'll talk properly about this. Promise?" "I promise." She squeezed his hand once more, then stood with recovered grace. "Now go get some rest, and Finn," her neural markings pulsed warm gold, "stop worrying about whether this is appropriate. I can hear you spiraling, and it's very loud." Finn laughed despite everything. "Noted, I'll try to spiral more quietly. That's all I ask." She left, and Finn sat alone in the observation deck, his mind full of everything they hadn't said aloud but had definitely communicated through the telepathic connection they were building. Tomorrow. They'd talk tomorrow. Finn had approximately 12 hours to figure out how to articulate feelings that Lyra had already heard anyway. His brain, being helpful, spent those 12 hours composing increasingly elaborate mental speeches that presumably broadcast into the empty space around him. Somewhere on the ship, he was certain Lyra was hearing every single one and smiling. The final Thaler-Vreen negotiation session went smoothly, both delegations arriving with compromise proposals, genuine willingness to find common ground replacing the hostility that had dominated earlier talks. Lyra mediated with her characteristic skill, though Finn noticed she was being more careful with her telepathic engagement. Not pushing as hard, taking breaks to rebuild her shields, pacing herself through the long session. By evening, a preliminary agreement was reached. Not complete resolution, centuries of conflict wouldn't vanish in a week, but a framework for ongoing diplomatic engagement. Both species would establish formal communication channels. Trade negotiations would begin. The threat of immediate war had passed. It was a genuine victory, and the Helianthus crew celebrated with appropriate professional satisfaction. But Finn navigated the congratulatory atmosphere in distracted tension, hyper-aware of Lyra across the room, remembering her promise. "We'll talk properly about this." The celebration wound down around 2200 hours. Crew members dispersed to quarters or recreational areas. Finn returned to the linguistics lab, which had become their unofficial meeting point. Lyra arrived 15 minutes later. She looked nervous, her neural markings pulsing uncertain colors, her usual composure slightly disrupted. Finn found it endearing that someone who could literally hear his thoughts could still be nervous about a conversation. "We need to talk about what's happening between us," she said, sitting across from him. Finn's carefully maintained composure cracked. "You can hear everything I'm thinking. You already know what's happening. I know what you feel. I don't know what you want to do about it." Lyra met his eyes directly. Rez and I don't typically form close relationships with telepathically silent species. The intimacy imbalance is too significant. I can hear you constantly, but you can't hear me. "You're not silent to me," Finn said, the realization crystallizing as he spoke. "I've learned to read your neural markings, the way your expressions shift, the tone of your voice. I might not be telepathic, but I'm a xenolinguist. Reading nonverbal communication is literally my expertise." Lyra's markings pulsed surprised gold. She stopped, then smiled with genuine warmth. "That's probably the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "Really?" "Because I can do better. I've been mentally composing elaborate speeches for the past 12 hours, just in case." "You absolutely have, and I've heard every single one." She was laughing now, some of her nervous tension dissolving. The sonnet was particularly ambitious. "I wasn't actually going to recite a sonnet." "Good, because it didn't scan properly. Your meter needs work." They laughed together, and Finn felt something in his chest loosen. The recognition that they could navigate this conversation with humor alongside seriousness. "Talk to me honestly," Lyra said, her expression turning more serious. "About the complications. Because there are significant complications to a relationship between telepathic and non-telepathic individuals." Finn nodded. "Privacy concerns. You'll always hear my thoughts, even when I'd prefer you didn't. Intimacy imbalance. You know everything I'm feeling, but I have to guess about you. Professional complications from fraternization between officers." All accurate concerns. Lyra's markings pulsed thoughtful blue. "What else?" "Fear that this is novelty rather than genuine connection. That I'm just fascinated by telepathy as a communication system, and once that wears off, there's nothing sustainable." Finn forced himself to voice the deeper worry. "Or that you're just enjoying having someone who's not afraid of you, and that's not the same as actually wanting to be with me." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her neural markings cycling through complex colors. "Those are legitimate concerns. Should I tell you what I've been thinking? You can project deliberately now, like you did yesterday." I've always been able to, I just don't usually choose to. Her smile was gentle. But for you, I'm willing to try. She focused and Finn felt something shift, not in the air but in his awareness. Like a door opening in his mind that he hadn't known existed. Lyra's mental voice came through clearly, warmer and more intimate than her spoken words. I'm genuinely terrified of this. I've never let anyone this close. Most people can't handle the constant telepathic perception, and I've learned to keep my distance rather than face repeated rejection. Finn felt the emotional weight behind her words, vulnerability she'd binn hiding beneath professional competence. But you're different, she continued. You treat my telepathy like a language worth learning rather than a violation to fear. You think at me deliberately. You project comfort when I'm overwhelmed. You've turned one-sided perception into actual communication. Her projection intensified, and Finn felt the full force of her affection. I'm fascinated by your mind, by how you think in linguistic patterns, by your curiosity about everything, by the way your thoughts feel like sunlight. But I'm fascinated by you, Finn. The person who brings me tea when I'm stressed, who makes terrible jokes to see me smile, who stayed with me through telepathic burnout because you cared more about my well-being than professional propriety. The projection faded and Lyra spoke aloud again. So yes, there are complications, significant ones, but I'm willing to try if you are. Finn felt his own thoughts organizing into clear response, and he projected deliberately. I'm absolutely willing to try, even knowing it won't be easy, even knowing there's no roadmap for this. We'll have to establish boundaries, Lyra said practically. Times when you need mental privacy, when I should actively not engage with your thoughts even if I hear them. Consent protocols for deeper telepathic connection. Disclosure to the command structure about our relationship. All reasonable requirements. Finn reached across the workspace offering his hand. Should we try this? Carefully, professionally, with appropriate boundaries and clear communication. Lyra took his hand, and through the physical contact, Finn felt her deliberately project warmth and affection and nervous excitement. Yes, she thought clearly. Let's try. They talked for hours after that, establishing the practical boundaries Lyra had mentioned, discussing how to navigate professional dynamics, acknowledging the very real challenges ahead. But underneath the practical conversation, there was something else. The growing comfort of two people learning each other's mental rhythms, building intimacy through honest communication in its most direct form. The weeks that followed were adjustment. Finn learned when Lyra needed him to actively shield his thoughts, during sensitive diplomatic work where his reactions could influence her telepathic perceptions, during moments when he needed genuine privacy to process difficult emotions. Lyra learned to modulate her telepathic engagement, choosing when to listen actively versus letting Finn's thoughts remain background noise, deliberately projecting her own mental voice so Finn could hear her responses rather than having to guess. They disclosed their relationship to the captain, who was surprisingly understanding. As long as it doesn't compromise your professional effectiveness, your personal lives are your own business. Just maintain appropriate conduct during duty hours. The crew adjusted to seeing them together. Some Resonai colleagues warned Lyra about the dangers of attachment to telepathically silent species. Some human crew members expressed concern about the intimacy imbalance. But Finn and Lyra navigated the concerns together, building something neither had expected but both valued. Genuine partnership between incompatible communication systems. 3 months into their relationship, Finn was working in the linguistics lab when Lyra appeared in the doorway. She leaned against the frame with a smile that suggested she was up to something. "What are you thinking about?" she asked innocently. Finn looked up from his research and deliberately thought very loudly. "I'm thinking about how striking you look when you're pretending to be casual about something you're clearly planning." Lyra's neural markings pulsed amused gold, still hearing everything. "Good." Finn stood and crossed to where she waited. "What if I don't want you to stop hearing? What if I like having someone who knows exactly what I'm thinking?" Then think louder. She pulled him closer, her expression shifting to something more serious. I dare you. So Finn did. He projected deliberately, clearly, the thought he'd been carefully managing for months but had stopped trying to hide weeks ago. I'm in love with you, and I'm terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, and I wouldn't change this for anything. Lyra's neural markings flared brilliant gold. The color Finn had learned meant deep affection and happiness. Her hand found his face, gentle touch accompanying her projected response. For the first time, she let him hear her thoughts as clearly as she heard his. Warmth and love and absolute certainty. Lyra deliberately sharing her internal experience rather than just her perception of his. I love you too, she projected. Even though you think too loudly during diplomatic sessions and you still can't get the meter right in your mental sonnets. Finn laughed against her shoulder. I'll work on the sonnets. Please don't. They're terrible, but they're yours, and I love hearing them anyway. They stood together in the linguistics lab. Two people from incompatible communication systems who'd built a bridge through honesty and deliberate vulnerability. In a universe built on language barriers and fear of the unknown, they'd found the most dangerous and most beautiful form of communication, absolute transparency between minds. Finn projected one more thought, clear and certain. Thank you for hearing me. Lyra's response came back warm and immediate, always. Outside the lab windows, stars wheeled past in endless patterns. Inside, a telepathic resonai and a human linguist maintained the kind of connection most species considered impossible, built on thoughts shared freely, emotions communicated without words, and the simple revolutionary act of letting someone hear you completely. In the mess hall 2 decks away, another crew member happened to think a passing thought about the day's work. Lyra smiled against Finn's shoulder. Someone just broadcast that they're happy the negotiation succeeded. Are you always going to narrate other people's thoughts? Only the interesting ones. She pulled back to meet his eyes, her neural markings pulsing with mischief. Yours are still the loudest, though. Hard to focus on anyone else when you're broadcasting love this intensely. Want me to tone it down? Absolutely not. Lyra kissed him gently, and through their joined contact, Finn felt the full depth of her affection. No words needed, just pure emotional resonance. When they finally separated, she projected clearly. This is what intimacy feels like for telepaths. Not invasion, not violation, just connection, pure and honest and